So when we kick off today, we wanted to look at brand and culture. So tonight's guest speaker is Hamish Pringle, and before I introduce Hamish and have him do the main presentation, just wanted to give you a little bit of background about Bridge and really what we're going to be doing over the next few months. Instead of doing my normal talk about brand and culture, because I think we have such a great expert in the room, I really wanted to begin to think about brand and culture and how it shapes, and not only in our organization, but in all of our organizations. In order to do each talk, I always go back a little bit in my timeline. And this slide always stayed very firmly in my mind. About 4 years ago, we did a lecture series across Taiwan in which we looked at brand and culture in that market. And this slide always stands out for one that I had used as the quote from Tony Hsieh from Zappos. And are you familiar with Zappos? And for those of you who aren't, I would suggest giving it a quick Google. But it's an online shoe retailer in the US. And what Tony did with his organization is he realized how important culture was and how that was going to support the organization going forward. It was his people. And it's funny, in an interview with Tony, he actually mentions, because they originally were an online shoe retailer, and they have now expanded. But in an interview with him, he actually only ever owned 1 or 2 pairs of shoes. And in his own words, he doesn't even really like shoes that much. So it wasn't that he was setting up a company that was his passion for a product of his. It was actually his passion for setting up a company that was going to be backed by a great group of people. And that's what grew Zappos from a very small company into a major organization, simply by building a culture. And then that begins, I've always played around with this terminology about 2 sides of the same coin. Brand and culture, 2 sides of the same coin. And as I began to look deeper, I had a very interesting experience in 2014. Now, some of you who've come to BridgeTalks do like seeing this slide. Because that was my home for almost a year. Not a bad place to live. It's in Palm Beach. So it formerly was the Ritz-Carlton in Palm Beach. And Bridge was commissioned to work on a massive employee engagement program with this. Because it had Ritz-Carlton prior owner, or prior operator, but then it turned into a new fashion luxury property. And how these 2 brands behaved were very different. A Ritz-Carlton brand had a lot of structure, a lot of verbiage, a lot of clear guidelines of who we are. And they were also part of a much bigger family. And then overnight, the 600 staff were told that they were now going to be called O. Now, many Americans couldn't even understand what O was in terms of French for water. In fact, it often got called OO. I used to work for the Ritz-Carlton in Palm Beach, and now I work for OO. So there was a lot of disengagement with this employee population about who they were, who was their identity. And the interesting thing that has happened now on reflection on this project is as I pulled out of Bridge and pulled firmly onto this project, I spent most of the year there. So I'd be 1 month on property, and I have 2 months holiday back here, or 2 weeks holiday back here to design material, to go back for 5 weeks, to come back for 2, go back for another month. So primarily this became my residence. And what happened was I was actually the most fortunate person in looking at culture, primarily because I lived amongst it. And it's absolutely fascinating. As a consultant, we go in at our 9 o'clock, we spend a day there, and we go home, and we forget about it. Possibly. Chances have it you never forget about it. Or as a manager, you go in, and even though you take your work home, you still don't live amongst the people. And as the days went on, I got to know their stories, and I got to know who they were as individuals. I got to know how John's, on his daughter's 4th birthday, liked fingernail polish and wanted her nails painted. I knew somebody's popsicle story about when they were a child. I got to understand what each one of these people were as individuals. And that's why, as I began to reflect on it, this brand and culture, is I was actually so fortunate as a consultant because I actually lived in the culture. And then I actually began to think about what is culture? What is the culture of an organization? What does it look like? And I began to think from many, many different points. For my early education, I have a sociology and anthropology, psychology degree going on over here. And then I have a business degree going on here. And then I have lots of experience working with companies. And that's kind of the way I began to see culture. It's alive. And actually, when you begin to look at what is a culture, it is actually simply this. If you were to imagine looking at any one of our organizations with a microscope, what would it look like? And what actually is it? And then I began to look at that all cultures do behave the same way, whether it be a blood culture, whether it be an organization, whether it be a Boy Scout group, a religious group. Actually, the organics of a culture behave similarly no matter what it is. It's simply a defined area. Let me go back to the moving. It's simply a defined area with a lot of things moving inside of it. So if I was actually to look at an organization from a scientific point of view, that's probably what it looks like. A brand defines the area, your building defines the area, whatever it is that defines your area, and then our people sit inside it and all move around. And as they're moving around, that's kind of probably what it looks like if I was to put a microscope over the top of an organization. And some other work that we're now doing with a different organization around culture is I began to look at what is the difference between brand and culture, or an organization and culture, and how do they kind of define difference? Because if they are two sides of the same coin, therefore they also have to have a difference to them to coexist. There has to be a yin and a yang. And so when I began to look at brand, I think about it sometimes like this. It's got structure, it's got stability. It sends out a promise, whether it through be its website, whether it's through its marketing, referrals. It comes with a promise of who it is as an organization. That's supported by its vision and values. And that's why we often use that in an organization, the vision and the values. But it is still virtual. It only exists in my right brain and I'm in an emotive state. You love it, you hate it, you worship it, you cherish it, but it is still virtual. I can't physically touch the brand, but yet I can emotionally connect to it. And then I have to look at culture on the other side of the coin and what does it look like? And it really looks quite different to me. The culture is unpredictable. The people have a level of unpredictability because we're humans. And as humans, we require some level of flexibility. For those who have attended the last BridgeTalks, we talked a lot about happiness in the workplace. And we looked at autonomy and mastery and purpose. And what is it that drives that culture? But culture is all about delivery, because it's human. They have to have goals. We have to have standards. We have to do something. But where we talk about vision and values within the brand, in culture we talk about beliefs and behaviors, because it's alive. And when it's alive, it keeps bringing me back to this again. It's always moving, it's always shaping, it's changing as it's going. So the question I have to look at is, if something is two sides of the same coin, can they coexist happily? Can we create an engaged workforce that actually brings these two worlds together? What do you think? Can I bring this together to coexist? It's quite simple sometimes, because they are two sides of the same coin. And instead of looking at two sides of the same coin, possibly it's about sharing the vision of perfection. Because a brand does come with that promise. And for people to be part of the promise, that's part of the perfection that a culture needs. So over the next few months, Bridge is going to be commissioning and working on some research to try to delve a little bit deeper into this idea of what is culture and how does it coexist in a world of brand. Because to ask employees to engage to something is a very big ask if they don't feel part of it. But the interesting thing is, when we talk about culture from different standpoints, not just from a biological standpoint, it's the one thing that human beings have been doing since the beginning of our species. We've been creating communities since we began meeting each other. Well, if you look at cave paintings, they're telling a story. And that is part of a community. People generally work better when they're part of something. And that is really what a culture is. The brand is the bit that defines it all together, brings it with that promise. Our jobs is to make sure that we engage people to that. But we create an environment that is bringing it all together because, honestly, this isn't anything new to us. We've been creating communities since the beginning of our species. So when I look at Facebook, that's not really that innovative. They used technology and used it well, but all they actually did was just tap into our most basic of instincts to want to be in a community, to want to connect with each other, to want to share common sense of purpose, common sense of values, common sense of interest. That's simply all of these LinkedIn and Facebooks have done is tapped into what we already know is inside of us. As people, we work better in communities. And that's truly what a culture is in a brand, to me. This is quite a little bit of a wordy slide, and I tend not to want to talk to slides, but this came from this is an this one's an anthropological standpoint of culture. So we can look and we can get a physical state of culture. We can have an anthropological concept. We can have a sociological concept. So what we're going to be doing with our research, and some of you I will be asking to join in and have discussion points with, is really beginning to see what drives brand and culture, but not just look at it from its normal state. Look at it from all of its angles. Because culture sits inside of our environment, but it also comes from very different forms, from a biological state and looking at blood cultures. It's a defined area with parts moving inside. When we look at it from physics, what is drive and momentum that drives something forward? From an anthropological state, from sociology, and our desire to build communities, theology and religions. All of these thinkings share a lot of common ideas when it comes to culture. And when we actually begin talking about what is employee engagement to brand, brand is our guide, brand is our vision, and it's about how we look at culture as being alive, but it actually follows a very similar process no matter which one of the sciences you begin to look at it, because it is all about creating a defined area for us to work inside. It's about how we do that. So the research will look at it from very different angles, but with the center being organizational culture. What can we learn in our organizations about stuff that we already knew before? You know, when we're building from religions to armies, they behave in a certain way because there's a common set of principles for them. Okay, so that's really where I wanted to finish, to give you a bit of idea of where our thinking is around culture, but kind of open up your mind a little bit to thinking of that culture does exist because it's alive. And when we have something that is brand and is virtual, it can coexist. It is two sides of the same coin. And when we talk about the bit in the middle, which is the employee engagement, is then what do we need to do to inspire the community to live the brand and be the brand? And that's where Hamish is going to come in as an expert. Look, and I'm going to introduce you to Hamish in a moment. But thinking about timelines, and I was saying to Hamish earlier, I had to look at it as LinkedIn to find out when he was at Saatchi, because that's the very first time I met Hamish, and that was quite a few years ago. And thinking about, he's one of these people that really truly inspired me very early on in my career. He was working on your book with Marjorie, is it? Yeah, Brand Spirit. And I came in and I was doing some marketing and helping with some of the events set up and things like that. So I was very, very green. And I remember meeting Hamish at Saatchi and him taking me downstairs and into their innovation room, was that what it was called? Vision room. And showing me some of these holograms that appear on toothpaste. It was all brand new back then. And I remember looking at this thinking, wow, I can't believe they could print something like that on paper. I've aged myself now, and I've aged myself very well. But he was one of these people who truly inspired me. And when we began to look at BridgeTalks as a concept, that was the first name that I threw into the hat of somebody that I wanted to see speak. He's a very accomplished speaker, a very accomplished writer on this subject, and on many subjects, former Director General of the IPA, and a real true advocate for both brand and culture. So I will take a seat, and I'm going to pass you over to Hamish Pringle, and I'd like you to welcome him. Thank you.